So yeah, well, my name is Guillermo Belmar, and I'm going to be talking about language revitalization and the de-territorialization. And I ask for forgiveness if I mispronounce any of these two words, because I always struggle a little bit, especially with the de-territorialization one. It's a very long word. So the idea today, going to be talking very briefly about minoritization and nation states, because that then links to the idea of deterritorialization, and then we're going to talk about the computer-mediated communication and how it links to this idea of deterritorialization and how this is related to audience design strategies and decontextualization. And finally, I'm going to bring up the virtual communities as breathing spaces as a sort of as a strategy to avoid some of the negative aspects that may come with this deterritorialization. So as we all know, so I'm gonna go a bit fast in this part because I know that most of you that are already working in revitalization are familiar with these ideas, right? So the idea of nation state building being that the nation, your community is this is an imagined community. We don't know everyone that is part of our nation state. These being some sort of community that we can relate to through the existence of standardized language or some standardized cultural practices, and how these nation states are very often based on, when we talk about language, on ideologies of one nation, one language, and therefore any other thing that is not this one language that is for this one nation just cast aside to the periphery, and how this then leads to minorization. There's also some distinction in the literature between nation and state. Nation sometimes being more related to a cultural notion of nation and being related to descent, whereas some authors talk about state being social contract, but that's not entirely true. And that just one way of talking about it. But citizenship, as we know, is not a free choice, right? We don't decide what country we're a citizen of, and even when we have sometimes the choice, if we're privileged enough to change our citizenship, we don't have free choice to change that. That comes with certain limitations, and also affiliation and self-identification with a given culture, um, quote unquote, this nation that should be for descent is actually very subjective, and it may change throughout time, and it doesn't have to be through descent. Some have claimed that there's a weakening of the nation state. Now, notice that I wrote a question mark there. I don't know if weakening is the word, but there is a change perhaps in how this works and how we conceptualize about this. There are certain forces that are changing this so-called globalization. So how we economically are all interconnected and culturally as well, and also from below. There's a lot of in certain situations. There's a lot of calls for decentralization, etc. So what is the most important part here, basically, is that from a couple of decades on, the state is no longer the sole provider of materials that we can use to self-identify with, right? So culturally, specifically, we get a lot of different models that we wouldn't have gotten before. And these kind of like the idea of a globalization, but at the same time of more local or more emphasis on importance of the local is some have called it globalization. And this has more or less coincided with the emergence of computer mediated communication, which has, of course, changes the way we communicate and the way we interact with each other. It has changed also the availability of a lot of resources that we didn't have access to before. Um, and it's mostly written language, even though it's largely modeled after spontaneous speech, but it's still mostly written, and that is gonna be important for our discussion on minoritized languages and minoritized varieties. It is interesting that it's still modeled after spontaneous speech, which favors the use of minoritized varieties. but it's still written, which again is going to be relevant later on. When we talk about media, so computer-mediated communication, the emergence of that also came with the emergence of new type of media, and language revitalization in general with media has had some sort of love-hate relationship. Um, so ever since Fishman's famous revisited language shift in 2001, he was a bit wary of media, but we also need to take into account that he was talking about media more like a top-down thing, so more like the government creates some media in these languages, but not as the community creating the media. So it's a very different kind of media that he was talking about, and he was very wary of virtual communities. But then again, what virtual community meant 20 years ago is not the same, and the concept has changed a lot. Now we are all part of a lot of virtual communities. We could even argue that what we're doing right now is some sort of temporary virtual community that we're establishing, and we are exchanging ideas. So virtual communities have become very much a reality in our daily life, and most of us partake in a lot of them, and they are very important for our socialization in general. One issue that I always like to put forward when I'm talking about this is that it's very difficult when we talk about social media and language revitalization and virtual communities, all these things. It is very difficult to attribute a direct relationship between these two things, between consumption of these media or participation in these virtual communities and linguistic behavior of any individual. Um, Mostly because it's almost impossible to determine what causes what, right? So am I taking part in this virtual community in this language because I speak this language already, or will I use this language more if I take part in this virtual community? This is almost impossible to prove which one comes first, but there seems to be some sort of at least correlation that these two things go hand in hand. So social media, therefore, all these changes that we were talking about that have happened in media and have happened in the conceptualization of virtual communities, basically, especially now, this idea that you as individual are no longer tied to spatial or temporal constraints to take part in a community, or even to create your own community or to create your own media. Like nowadays, you have resources. Of course, we are all at the mercy of certain algorithms in social media platforms and in the internet as a whole. So the amount of people that maybe will have access to you or will find you or will follow you will depend on a lot of things. But you have some options now to create your own media and to create your own communities and take part on communities that are very far away, and that you wouldn't have had the option to partake in before. And all these, again, like this idea of geographically far communities that you can now take part in, goes with this idea of the de-territorialization of the concept of language, by which I mostly mean that now there is increased mobility that has led to a lot of languages spoken in places where they had never been spoken before. And these places can be very far away, but crucially here, because migration has always existed, but crucially here, you can be geographically very, very far away, but now because of social media and because of virtual communities, you can basically function as any other member of the community that is in the geographic area. Let's just say the heartland if you want. So it doesn't matter where you are, you can actually still function virtually as any other member of the community. And this has brought about new realities, new perspectives, and new usages in a lot of languages. So language now used in communicative changes that it wasn't used before. It brings some sort of association with modernity as well. And it's again this idea of social media platforms that allow us to create virtual communities that we can take part in whatever we are. Now, this all sounds very nice, and it is very good. There are some caveats though, and I'm going to talk first about the biggest one, at least in my opinion. And this is audience design, or what happens when with audience design. in the internet as a whole. Some of you may be familiar with the term audience design from Bell, social linguistics. Basically, it's the idea that when we speak with somebody that we want to build some sort of rapport with, um, we accommodate our linguistic expressions to them, to that person that we're speaking to. So we try to more or less find like a middle ground between how I speak and how they speak, and we accommodate a little bit. However, we know that in minoritized contexts, in general, accommodation is always towards the dominant language, because that's one of the things that minoritization is, and therefore, when we are in a context where two varieties have obviously a very obviously power differential, you will always accommodate to the powerful one, to the dominant one. And this, of course, has consequences with language choice online. So when we talk about the audience of any online post, so if you think about you're on Twitter and you're writing a post, um, you are imagining your audience. You don't know exactly who you're writing this post to, so you're imagining who is going to read it, and then you're going to design your message accordingly. And this can pose a problem for minoritized languages, because when you imagine an audience in a place like Twitter, you can imagine this audience being mostly maybe English speaking, rather than, I don't know, any other minoritized language that you can think of. And in that respect, um, audience design um, can be a hindrance sometimes for the use of minoritized languages online. In fact, we have found this in some studies. Now, I want to say here that most of the observations from studies that I will be mentioning come from studies that we've done in minoritized languages in Western Europe. So the context is different. It's not the same everywhere, of course. So just bear in mind that a lot of the observations that I will be sharing from studies come from the context of minoritized languages in Western Europe. But in that setting, this desire to be understood was one of the reasons that a lot of people were mentioning when they explained why they didn't use the minoritized language on social media. And these this just means that languages that are minoritized are at risk of only being used when targeting a very specific smaller audience when you're talking. I kind of I kind of see it in my behavior on Twitter. I tweet a lot in English, but then sometimes if I have to tweet something that is local, I will do it in Catalan. Sometimes consciously I break this, but it's normally consciously that I will actually try to break it. And this basically this idea of the de-territorialization of language. So the language is no longer geographically bound, also can very easily lead to decontextualization of language. So it's no longer tied to a particular geography, can very easily lead to no longer tied to any particular context for this language. And when you detach language from the context where it is, right, the cultural and the historical context, this very easily can lead to these ideologies of language only used for communication, in which minoritized languages are very much at risk because cannot compete. Mm, sorry about that. So there is a dark side to the idea of the territorialization of language. But um, well, first, an environment that is actually particularly bad for this is tourism. And this again comes from some observations in in some virtual communities. Um, we can have here some things of yeah, landscapes, traditions, words. A lot of things can be commodified for tourism, but in general, this commodification is done through the dominant language, and therefore, um, this environment is particularly resistant to the use of minoritized language. Again, because audience design, the idea that if what you want is to promote the place for tourism, your audience is probably not an audience that speaks the language. So one way to kind of like go around this problem in social media is the establishment of breathing spaces. That would be traditionally some from Fishman. This is a place where the minoritized language can be used freely. More recently, scholars working on translanguaging have conceptualized this more like a place where you don't have to compete with the majority language, with this idea of competition. And this can be a lot of places and could be a virtual community. And when we talk about a virtual community, what I mean is it can be your list of friends or profiles that you follow. So this idea of your feed, and that also creates your virtual linguistic landscape. So the people you follow and the languages in which they post will determine what you see and the languages that you see in a particular social media platform. And the more people you follow, again, this feeds also the algorithm that will decide what kind of things they show you more. It can also be a group or a server that you're part of, so a Facebook group or a Discord server, and it can be open or closed. Yeah, can be just anyone can join, or increasingly there's a lot of closed groups now. And then it can also be the set of interactions around a hashtag, which is maybe a more recent idea. Hashtags have a lot of different functions. They can index a lot of things like topic or identity, but they can also, or actually through indexing these things, they can also design who gets the message. So they can also design the audience, and therefore hashtags can be a tool to fight this negative aspect of audience design um, if we want to. Okay, so the if a virtual community is to work as a breathing space for monetized language, some of the characteristics that me and my colleague Maggie Glass put forward is that it should be a community where the minoritized language is the only language of the community or the preferred language of the community, where the language is somehow somewhat the subject of discussion, especially if this discussion happens in the minority language, and where the status of the language is not contested. Now, these are not exclusive, so it's not like you have like all virtual communities should have all these characteristics. It's also not true that these are the only characteristics that may function as breathing spaces, because there's a lot of different environments and a lot of contexts. Therefore, if there is a certain context in which um, the language is not the preferred language of the community yet, but there's a group of people that are all learning the language and engaging with the language, and maybe that is what is working for that community as a breathing spaces at that moment, right? So again, these come from observations based on some Western European languages, but context matters a lot in defining what can work as a breathing space. So looking at virtual communities, if we actually take a look at language use, topics, and status, which is the three topics mostly that kind of will help us understand whether this is working or not in a particular context. So based on observations on Catalan, Aragonese, and North and West Frisian, this is some things that we've found so far. We found that a lot of these communities portray either dominant language almost exclusively or minoritized language exclusively. So there's a bit of it's one or the other. But a lot of the language, a lot of the communities that have specific language policy saying only the minoritized language actually end up being very highly multilingual, especially multilingual with a lot of minoritized languages, which we thought was quite interesting. A lot of the topics of discussing tend to be around the minoritized language or around the situation of the language, or sometimes the geography, which again is um, an interesting finding if we think about the fact that most of these communities are not necessarily tied to geography, as in like the members are not in a geographical specific area, but still the geography seems to be very important. So the language seems to still be contextualized in a particular geography and a particular history and a particular culture, even if members are no longer. And then just some final remarks that I had. Yeah. So one of the problems that we find is that there's a low percentage of community members that are participating actively in these communities. So you may have, I'm just gonna say some numbers now, but imagine there's a community that has 200 followers, but maybe there's only 10 or 20 that are actually posting and commenting. That doesn't mean that everyone else is not participating though, because you can participate also by reading these things, right? And maybe you read them every day, maybe you read all of them, but this is hidden. We cannot measure that. But this can actually be key for further engagement. Perhaps at that moment in time, what you need is to read and engage in that hidden way. And then maybe at some point, you will start participating more actively. So even if it's hidden, we should not um, we should not undervalue this kind of participation either. There seems to be some sort of importance of institutional support, mostly around spelling. There's a lot of insecurities around spelling, um, lack of instruction plus harsh peer language policing. Sometimes there's unfortunately people online that are very um, well, just like waiting for people to make mistakes and correct them, and this creates a lot of insecurity. Just a message to everyone that is here listening: please don't be that kind of person. When we talk about minoritized context, as you know, minorization comes with gatekeeping of a lot of resources. So just being this person online, being this person that has um, that harshly criticizes mistakes online. This is just another minorization tool. Please don't be that person. Hashtags, as I said before, it can be a way to select audience and a way to gather in a community in platforms that where you cannot build a group, such as Twitter, for example, or TikTok. And this is just some examples of how, if you look for the hashtag Catalan on Twitter, you can clearly see that it's used for that particular language, not just the topic, but like to actually tweet in that language. And finally, the idea that a lot of these communities are very welcoming to other minorities, especially minorities that are closely related. And this is from a study that will be published soon on a West Frisian Facebook page, in which there are 12 languages used, and a lot of minoritized Germanic languages such as Low Saxon or Liweders or Bills also being used in the same platform. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.